What if the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest had never happened? The Roman border, 100 CE. The year is 100 CE. The Emperor Trajan has just recently ascended to become Emperor of Rome in succession to Emperor Nerva. Rome is at peace, and its writ runs from Britannia in the north to the Sahara Desert in the south, and from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the Syrian Desert in the east. Despite the injunctions of Caesar Augustus, Rome's first ever emperor, nearly a century earlier, not to expand Rome's borders, Trajan, who would go on to expand Rome's borders more substantially than any other emperor, is casting his eye around to see where he might expand. Dacia, in what is now Romania, is a probable target, not least because Rome has waged several unsuccessful wars against the Dacians since the mid-80s CE. And indeed, Trajan would go on to conquer Dacia before the end of 106 CE. But imagine if Trajan had set his eyes on conquering Polonia, or the land of the Jutes, the names by which the Romans would have understood Poland and Denmark. Of course, this seems far-fetched to the modern mind, because we know that the Romans never fully conquered Germania, and so were never in a position to expand into Poland or Denmark. But it is entirely plausible that they could have. After all, until the disastrous Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 CE saw 3 full Roman legions ambushed and destroyed in the forests of northern Germania that year, the Romans had been making great strides in conquering Germania and looked set to complete the process within a decade or two. Soon, many a Roman imagined, all of Germania would be reduced to Roman rule, much as Julius Caesar had conquered all of Gaul. And yet, it never happened. After the disaster at the Teutoburg Forest, Augustus pulled his troops back to the Rhine River and fixed it as the northern border, advising his successors not to engage in further conquests. Here we explore what might have happened if he hadn't done so. What if the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest had never happened, and the Romans had gone on to conquer all of Germania? How different might the ancient world have looked, and what long-term implications would such a move have had? The Conquest of Germania. Before delving into what might have been, let's have a look at what actually was. The Romans understood Germania to be a vast region that was not entirely synonymous with modern-day Germany. Instead, Germania was an amorphous region named after the Germanic tribes that lived there. Roman writers like Tacitus and Pliny the Elder, who discussed it in their Germania and Natural History, understood it to, broadly speaking, be the region stretching from Gaul in the west, for which read modern-day France, and the Low Countries east to what they termed Polonia, a land broadly synonymous with modern-day Poland. They characterized mainland Denmark as being the land of the Jutes, another Germanic tribe, and modern-day interpreters are keen to point to a comparison with modern-day Jutland. But in reality, most Romans would have viewed this as part of Germania as well, along with parts of what we now term Czechia, Austria, and surrounding lands. The core of Germania for any Roman, though, was the wild and heavily forested land which lay between the river Rhine in the west and the river Oder to the east. The Romans began trying to systematically conquer this region in the 20s BCE after Caesar Augustus secured control over the Roman state. He wished to emulate his great-uncle's achievements 3 decades earlier in conquering Gaul, and would deploy extensive resources throughout his reign towards doing so. For many years, his armies made progress, securing the lands south and west of the river Rhine and building forts along the course of his natural defensive point. And in the years that followed, that they were making further progress in developing allies amongst the Germanic tribes of wider Germania and moving towards expanding to the river Elbe, the goal being to fix this as their northernmost border. The river Oder, which runs through modern-day Poland and rises in eastern Czechia, was probably a bridge too far, but the Elbe could easily have been conquered as far as. It was in the course of trying to do so that the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest put paid to Augustus's designs. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest is something of a misleading name. It should properly be called the Ambush and Massacre in the Teutoburg Forest. It revolved around two figures, a Roman and a German. In 7 CE, a Roman commander and aristocrat named Publius Quinctilius Varus had been appointed as the governor of the expanding province of Roman Germania, charged with pacifying the lands between the Rhine and the Elbe. He had as an ally a Germanic warrior named Arminius, a member of the Cherusci tribe, who had served in the Roman military for several years as an informant and go-between with his own people. In the summer of 9 CE, word arrived to Varus's camp that some disturbances were underway in northern Germania, and with the advice of Arminius, he marched northwards with 3 legions and auxiliary forces. Unbeknownst to him, Arminius had been plotting against the Romans for some time, and on the 8th of September 9th CE, the Romans were attacked in the Teutoburg Forest in Lower Saxony by tens of thousands of Germanic tribespeople who had formed a great alliance against the Romans. Over 4 days, the Romans tried to fight off a series of running skirmishes in the dense forest as they tried to retreat back to the River Rhine forts, but they were ultimately cut down in large numbers by the Germanic warriors. Varus and the 15,000 or so men that comprised his 3 legions were killed in one of the most devastating defeats the Roman military ever suffered. In the aftermath of it, Augustus, who was an aging emperor at that stage and would die 5 years later, ordered a tactical withdrawal to the River Rhine, abandoned efforts to conquer the lands eastwards to the Elbe, and left advice to his successors that they should henceforth consolidate Roman control over the lands they had conquered and not attempt any further conquests. The Rhine should be established as the northern border in Germania. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest was pivotal in this decision. The border at the Elbe. Of course, nobody can be entirely sure what might have happened if the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest had never happened. But it seems plausible to think that if Arminius had not assembled a confederacy of Germanic tribes together to ambush and destroy the 3 Roman legions in 9 CE, that the Romans would have continued to expand their control over central Germania and would have eventually expanded eastwards to the River Elbe. In fact, it is more than plausible given how disunited the Germanic people were. Within a few years of the ambush, they collapsed back into fighting amongst each other, so the alliance Arminius built up was something of an aberration. We can imagine that if the ambush had never occurred, that at some stage in the lengthy reign of Emperor Tiberius, Augustus's stepson and successor, who ruled from 14 CE to 37 CE, the Romans would have reached the River Elbe. They would have fixed the border here. Roman knowledge of the geography of the lands beyond, what they termed Polonia, was very limited, and while some would have proposed further conquests, perhaps as far as the River Oder, to the east of modern-day Berlin, these would have been impractical, particularly so when we consider that in order to progress further, the Romans would have been entering into territories with much colder, harsher winters of a kind which they were simply unused to anywhere closer to the Mediterranean. Thus, the border would have been fixed at the Elbe in what is now central eastern Germany, rather than the River Rhine, as it actually was near the border with France in western Germany. Border security. As to how border security would have worked in this scenario, we can learn a lot from examining how border security worked in actuality for the Romans on their northern borders in Britain and along the Rhine and Danube rivers in Europe. To put it bluntly, the Romans built walls and forts along their borders. In Britain, the wall that Emperor Hadrian had built across the country around where the border between England and Scotland lies today is well known, though it was just one such wall. His successor, Emperor Antoninus Pius, built a second wall further to the north in what was then called Caledonia. On the continent, the Limes Germanicus, or Germanic frontier, was a vast array of walls and forts stretching along the river Rhine from the Low Countries all the way through Germany to Austria. There were then a succession of land walls between the Rhine and the Danube River before the Limes Danubian commenced, running all the way to the Black Sea. These were border walls that used the natural defenses provided by the River Rhine and River Danube to provide major protection. The Romans would have used the River Elbe in the same way if they had conquered Germania, and instead of a Limes Germanicus along the River Rhine, it would have been found further east and north along the River Elbe. On these frontiers, walled sections would have been punctuated every few kilometers by forts that doubled as barracks for the Roman legions stationed here. No point of the Roman Empire was more heavily militarized, barring Syria in the east, where the Parthian Empire was a perennial threat to Rome's eastern flank. Thus, Germania would have been conquered, but it would have remained a highly militarized frontier zone. With that being said, these forts and legions would have also been integral to the development of Roman society in the newly conquered lands. Roman Germania. Germania would have developed over time in much the way that Gaul did from the late 1st century BCE onwards did. It would have been colonized by the Romans, and cities and towns would have been developed that then would have acted as examples to the natives in terms of the attractions of peaceful urban life with the trappings of Roman culture. The legions were central to how this process would have played out in Germania. Roman legionaries by this time were professional soldiers who served for up to 35 years. During more peaceful times, they acted more like local administrators and as a police force. Often they married, and their families would have come to live in the vicinity of the forts built in Germania. The forts would then have needed people to supply them with foodstuffs, as well as blacksmiths to repair their weapons, people to tend to their horses, and a wide range of other service industries. Before long, towns would begin to grow up around the forts, and some of these would eventually have become Roman cities in the newly conquered regions, though this process would have taken several generations. This was particularly the case in regions which had large amounts of raw materials that were of value in the markets of the wider empire. Germania, for instance, was heavily forested, and the region would have been exploited to provide wood for building programs in Rome and elsewhere. Thus, one of the implications of a Roman conquest of Germania is that it would have become much less densely forested by medieval times than it was in actuality. Overall, Germania would have become a mix of a stable, sedentary Roman province, but also one possessed of a continuing military function, one where defense of the border was central to the life of the people here, be they Roman or Germanic. Many of the Germanic people would have eventually reconciled themselves to Roman rule, and many men would have joined the Roman army as auxilia, non-citizen soldiers who made up a growing amount of the army by the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. Like all free subjects of the empire, in 212 CE, about 2 centuries after Roman rule was established in Germania in our theoretical situation, the free people of Germania would have all become Roman citizens, following a decree by Emperor Caracalla to that effect that year. Polonia, Jutland, and Scandza. This expanded region, Roman Germania, would have had different neighbors to those which the Romans had in actuality. In the real past, the Romans had to contend with the Germanic tribes who populated central Germania as their neighbors along the Rhine frontier for the next 2 centuries. In our hypothetical situation, the Romans would have subjugated these groups, and they would have Romanized over time in the same way that the Celts of Gaul did. Instead, they would have been dealing with different Germanic groups and other ethnic peoples such as the Balts and the Scythians along the northern and northeastern borders. For instance, what is now known as Denmark was populated in Roman times by a group known as the Jutes, from whom the word Jutland to describe mainland Denmark is derived. Further to the east, they would have been dealing with Germanic tribes, Balts and Scythians, in Polonia. The Romans would have had a mixed relationship with these groups. On occasions, they would no doubt have been at war with them, but at other times they would have enjoyed relatively peaceful relations and would have traded with them. We know this because this is exactly what the Romans did in real life with the Germanic groups of central Germany that lay beyond the Rhine border. There is even evidence that the Romans maintained forts and trading stations well east of the River Rhine fortifications, effectively in enemy territory. Thus, we might find that the Romans had trading stations well into Jutland and Polonia, trading with these people. These would have been attacked from time to time, but overall the different groups would have had much to gain from peaceful coexistence too. Had they conquered Germania, it is also very plausible that the Romans would have established a port or maritime trading station on the southern shores of the Baltic Sea and would consequently have been trading with the Germanic people who resided in what they termed Scandza, from which the modern word Scandinavia is derived. The northern peninsula of Europe contains rich resources of metals like copper and iron that the Romans would have found beneficial to acquire from Scandza. The fall of the Roman Empire. Another factor which we have to consider when assessing a Roman conquest of Germania is whether or not it would have impacted in any way on the manner in which the Roman Empire collapsed between the 3rd and 5th centuries CE. The primary cause of the fall of the Roman Empire was the mass breaching of its northern borders in Europe along the Rhine and Danube rivers by Germanic and Asiatic tribes like the Goths, Alans, Franks, Vandals, and Huns. A Roman conquest of Germania and the extension of the border further north and east to the river Elbe would have made very little difference. Perhaps it would have taken longer for these tribes to penetrate far into the empire and seize lands in places like southern Gaul or Hispania if the Roman Empire had simply been bigger in Europe. But a border at the river Elbe would not have afforded the Romans any greater security than they had in actuality. There still would have been a weak point where these tribes could penetrate through the region between the Elbe and the Danube that did not have a river as a natural defensive point. Perhaps the only difference is that the Romans would have had greater manpower to draw upon amongst the Germanic tribes of Germania that had been subjugated in the 1st century CE. Ultimately, though, these could not have withstood the sheer onslaught of groups migrating from as far afield as Mongolia towards the Roman Empire over a period of nearly 3 centuries between the 3rd and 5th centuries CE. The long-term implications. Perhaps the most substantial implications of a Roman conquest of Germania would have been the longer-term ones that occurred long after the Western Roman Empire had ceased to exist. Rome's legacy is all around us today. Take the example of Roman architecture. For centuries after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, people continued to use the buildings and infrastructure built by the Romans. For instance, the aqueducts, the large tower-like structures that the Romans built to convey water from rivers and lakes into their cities and towns, were used in many places throughout the Middle Ages and into early modern times, only being replaced in many cases when modern water infrastructure was developed in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. In one specific instance, that of the Aqua Vergine in Rome itself, it is still functional and brings water into Rome's fountains almost 2,050 years after it was first built around 20 BCE. The same goes for the Roman roads. They continued to be used for centuries after the Roman Empire had passed from the scene. Today, while many of the original roads themselves have been paved over and expanded, a lot of the modern road network of Western Europe mirrors the one developed by the Romans 2 millennia ago. Thus, when one drives on a motorway between some of the main cities going from Italy to northern France or along the French Riviera to Spain, they are often traveling along the exact same routes that the Roman roads passed through thousands of years ago. This is not the case in Germany, but almost certainly would be if the Romans had fully conquered Germania. This is not just the case with physical infrastructure. The same holds through with the culture and law of Germany. These are inherently Germanic today. German is a Germanic language, for instance, while the German legal system is derived in large part from the common law, a legal code which is developed from traditional Germanic honor codes. The situation is different as soon as one passes into France, Italy, Spain, and the like, the regions which Rome actually conquered. In these countries, French, Italian, and Spanish are spoken, Romance languages based on the vulgar Latin that was spoken here in late antiquity when the Germanic tribes began conquering these regions. If Germania had been conquered by the Romans, it is almost certain that a Roman language would also have evolved here, and people in Germania would speak a tongue which is derived in large part from the Latin of the Romans. Equally, as soon as one enters Western Europe, they are heading into jurisdictions where the legal code is based to a much greater extent on the civil law of the Romans rather than the Germanic common law. Again, if the Romans had conquered Germania, Germany's legal code today would be influenced to a much greater extent by the civil law of the Romans. Thus, the ways in which a hypothetical Roman conquest of Germania, had the Battle of the Teutoburg forest never occurred, would have changed Central Europe, would have been many and far-reaching, impacting on our world today even 2,000 years later. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel to show your support and watch more content like this. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. That's it for now. We'll see you in the next one.